So it's my great pleasure today to chair our session, which is dedicated to advances in alternative models of peer review. So as we all know, peer review has been rapidly diversifying over the last 2 decades as journals sort of play around with different ways of publishing and different ways of carrying out peer review. And in this session, we'll hear from 3 fantastic speakers about a few new innovative peer review and publishing paradigms, including overlay journals and collaborative reviews, as well as policies that can be used to increase transparency and make peer review more accountable. So just as a quick reminder, we are recording this session as well. So I'm not sure if we started doing that already. Right, we have. But that's basically all I have to say. So in the interest of time, I think we should just get started. So our first speaker today is Daniella Saderi. So I've got a bio here for you, Daniella. So Daniella is a co-founder and director of Pre-Review, which is a fiscally sponsored project of the Code for Science and Society. Pre-Review's mission is to bring more equity and transparency to the evaluation of research content, giving systematically excluded researchers better ways to find, train, and contribute to peer review. So Daniella holds a PhD in neuroscience from Oregon Health and Science University, during which she studied mechanisms of auditory processing in mammals. And she's a former Mozilla Fellow for Open Science in 2018 and 19. So today, Daniella will be giving a presentation called Rethinking Peer Review Through Openness, Equity, and Community Engagement. So feel free to share your screen and take over, Daniella.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for that kind introduction. And thanks to the rest of the committee for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. And thanks you all for being here. Let me see if I can manage to share. Here we go. All right. You read the title, so we can skip right through. I also want to mention that this presentation is actually available to anyone at the bit.ly/aimos2021-pre-review. There's going to be a few links that you may want to check out, so feel free to follow along. What I'm going to tell you today is the work that I've been very fortunate to do with a small but fantastic and passionate people of women, including Dr. Monica Granados and Dr. Samantha Hindle, who make up the other 2/3 of the leadership team, as well as Katrina Murphy, our project manager, and Dr. Antoinette Foster, who was our former Open Reviewers program manager and is now director of community transformation at Oregon Health and Science University. We're very much missing her, but her work is still here and alive. Well, you already know me. I'm Daniela, and all I want to add is that I'm Italian, missing Italy very much, living in Portland, Oregon since 2012. Portland rests on the traditional villages of many native nations, including the Multnomah, Wasco, and others. Nations that have been, as you know, occupied and displaced by European colonists. So we want to always acknowledge and recognize their communities are still alive, and want to consider donating to your indigenous nations. I thank also Dan for that acknowledgement at the beginning. All right, as we get started to the discussion, as I'm first, I'm sure that others will mention this, there are many issues with the peer review system, and we like to begin many of our workshops with this kind of brainstorming of what's wrong with peer review. And these are just a few that have driven our work in the past few years, and that is that the process is often slow and opaque. The pool of reviewers is small and homogeneous over and across dimensions of diversities. With most reviewers, as we can quantify them, it's often tricky, that are male and the mid or late stage of their career as researchers, and that are opaquely selected by journal editors as experts in the field. And that definition and label of expertise is rarely associated with actual training and training that has been delivered to researchers, because that is widely lacking across disciplines. I'd love to be proven wrong, but I think there is more and more training that is coming up, but it's still not formalized. And also the reviews and reviewers often go unrecognized for their contributions. So that is, those are some of the issues that have driven us since we got together in 2017, Sam and Monica and I, and we at that time were still researchers active in academia and just wanted to bring more value around preprints, and with that also bring some kind of elements of training into what it means to provide feedback. And that initial kind of dream evolved in the years, and the mission right now is focused around, yes, bring more transparency and openness to the scholarly peer review process via preprints. But specifically with the question of what does it mean to apply an equity lens and kind of recognize the differences of resources that different groups at different levels of the career, but across other dimensions of diversity, start with when they enter the process, if they actually enter it at all, as they've been excluded. And so we like to think about our approach around what we call the 3 pillars of pre-reviews. And the first being our approach to training, as we mentioned that we see that still lacking. And also our collaborative and community engagement, we're engaging researchers in live discussions around preprints. And then we kind of have been involved in building open infrastructures to kind of host and kind of see as the home for these communities to come together and share their contributions. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about those efforts today. And starts with training and mentoring. That is what we call Open Reviewers. It's a program that cohort-based training and mentoring program that was piloted first in 2020 with large support from eLife and the Mozilla Foundation. And the fact that it's a cohort-based, it means that the early career researchers that were engaged in the program, at the time 10, were all together in the same cohort, meeting weekly with us facilitators and trainers, and also kind of sharing knowledge and experience with each other. But they were also paired one-on-one with volunteer journal editors who were also trained, received some form of training by us, but also were there to help support the mentees in the writing of their first manuscript reviews. Oftentimes for this was the first time doing it. And the curriculum itself integrated element of how to provide constructive feedback, nonviolent communication, as well as an intentional focus on how systems of oppression that have kind of are everywhere in the way how society is built, have an influence in the peer review system and how us as individuals may approach giving feedback. And the curriculum of this pilot is very much centered around discussions in the North American space, and also the opportunity for reaching a major racial diversity in this pilot was focused on North America, with 50% of the slots dedicated to early career researchers who self-identified as underrepresented minorities in the US and Canada. So small pilot with a big dream of expanding it that we're still working on, and the idea of also creating a database of trainees who could be shared with journal editors, but also with others to kind of increase the reviewer pool, as we talked about at the beginning. And the resources from that pilot are largely developed by Dr. Antoinette Foster, myself, Sam, and Katrina, are now published on Zenodo as a reviewer guide. It's a very detailed guide on how to review, and also a bias reflection guide, which is just a process to start and begin thinking about what biases that we bring as individuals from our experience can impact the way that we select even manuscript to review, all the way to actually the way we deliver feedback, and a review assessment rubric for helping reviewers assess their work, but also help others. And Open Reviewers has grown now in different projects, as being a workshop from the 14-week to being like a 3-part workshop that we deliver to institutions, and also in a great collaboration that we just started with eLife and particularly with the Africa Archive, ADER Africa, and TCC Africa, to adapt the content in a train-the-trainer model that will be hopefully taken across the African continent to build capacity in the peer review pool in the continent. as well as applied to grant reviewers in collaboration with the Open Research Funders Group, and in delivering this training all the way at the beginning of research life, so undergrads, in collaboration with Dr. Rebecca Lijek, who's the leader of the team, and also Gary McDowell and others. So we're very happy to see this now expanding as a model. The second pillar is community engagement, and this is really stems from our first engagement with pre-review, when all we were doing is just bringing pre-review preprints to journal clubs, and we've been modeling this around community calls that Mozilla has taught us how to lead and facilitate, and these are just bringing researchers from across the world to discuss a preprint, and very oftentimes with the author's presence. And then the result is really having these discussions that can be formalized around a review that is then openly shared online. We've been doing some of this with different partners. More recently, we are going to try to experiment this as a more integrated way of actually providing feedback into the new overlay journal of JMIR publication, which is the JMIRX. We haven't started this yet, but we're very excited to see how authors may choose that as one form of review. In terms of like also giving a home for these reviews communities, we also have started communities on pre-review and the platform that could be just a community under the same topic of outbreak-related science, or has members of the same training, or an actual physical journal clubs like this new photosynthesis community that was just started. And so that brings us to the last part of my presentation, which is telling a little bit about the platform. I know I don't have a lot of time left, so please do flag me if I go over time. But I just wanted to share that the platform has been really trying to think about what are the needs and the experiences of early career researchers and researchers that have been traditionally left out of the system. And so in developing that, the first thing that this allows is for anyone with an ORCID ID to create an account. And what that does is that it creates actually one persona, as we call, that is the public persona of your profile on pre-review, with all your ORCID ID, if you want to display a name, contact that you can decide not to display, and anything that is public on ORCID, as well as another persona that is an anonymous persona that has a pseudonym that is made up of an animal and a color, like yellow elephant. And that is a persona that any user can use to sign their comments, their reviews, and their requests for reviews to maintain anonymity, but at the same time also maintain accountability, as that persona is still linked on the back end to the ORCID ID. And I can talk more about this in the breakouts if anyone is interested. Other options are, obviously, we are not a preprint servers, but preprints can be imported into the system. I'll show you in a second. And then they can be sorted by recent user activity. And the way to get a preprint into is just to type in or paste, better probably, the DOI of a preprint across preprint servers, if that's available. And then the metadata, if it's openly available, even the full PDF is displayed in pre-review. And then the three main options that a user has are to add a rapid pre-review, which is just answering a series of yes or no and sure questions, and then as well as requesting feedback from others and adding a longer review, which I'm going to show you in a moment. The results of many of these rapid pre-reviews is also aggregated and visualized for readers to help determine what's up with this preprint. And then the content could also be filtered per community. So this is important to us because we want to de-emphasize the fact that we can trust a single member of a research community just because they're probably popular or they're known, and kind of emphasize more a group effort of reviewing. And while the rapid reviews are only individuals, like each individual can issue one, the full pre-reviews actually can be authored by multiple people which is often the case for journal clubs. So we have a group of people who wrote it together, and this is just a recent example. And these reviews also get a digital object identifier, so they can be tracked, and they can be also linked across the print servers when they come from. And at the moment, we have links that appear in bioRxiv, medRxiv, European-C, as well as on Society, which is a new platform for aggregating efforts in preprint review. And hopefully something we're going to announce soon is a full author-driven request workflow that will start at the level of preprint submission with the open preprint system, such as Cielo preprint servers. So very excited about that. I want to leave you with just links and opportunities to hear more about what we're doing, work with us. We have an open job right now. Oh, and there's 3 R's for it. It's very current. And so I invite you all to share and apply. And I also want to thank our funders who currently are mainly eLife and past funders, and our fiscal sponsor, CSS. Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle. Fantastic. Finished perfectly on time as well, which is great. Okay, so I think for the structure of this session, we thought we might take questions at the end of the session, so we might just continue on. So our next speaker is Gary McDowell. Gary is the founder of Lightoller, a consultancy providing expertise on early career researchers with the goal of ensuring that the future generations of researchers can reach their potential to solve problems for society. Gary's originally from Northern Ireland and has a master's in chemistry and a PhD in oncology from the University of Cambridge. He carried out postdoctoral research at Boston Children's Hospital and Tufts University and helped organize a symposium in Boston in 2014 to give a voice to early career researchers. In 2016, he co-founded and became executive director of the nonprofit Future of Research. And since 2019, he has worked as a consultant focusing on advising institutions on how to better support future generations of researchers and to provide early career researchers with tools and strategies to affect change. So Gary will be speaking about peer review when it comes to bringing ECRs out of the dark when it comes to ghost reviewing and co-reviewing. So Gary, feel free to get started when you're ready.
Okie doke. Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. And I hope you can see everything okay. Great. I'm based in Chicago, on lands, unceded lands traditionally held by the Council of the Three Fires, as well as a number of other tribes. As Daniel mentioned, I'm from Northern Ireland, and I've been in the US now for 10 years. And I've really got into thinking about systemic issues that affect people in the academy. And sort of what has, up until recently, been somewhat of a side project or an area of interest, sort of hobby, if you will, has been the role of journal article peer review.
Gary, sorry, I just want to know because I don't think people can see your slides.
Oh. Let's see. If I stop and then try again. Is that working now?
Yeah, it says that you started screen sharing, but it doesn't show the slide. It just has a message saying you've started screen sharing. Are you in full screen mode? Maybe that's...
I am. Can you see this?
No.
Just see a black screen.
It worked when you weren't in full screen mode before when we were trying it out. So one option might be to show us that view. I know it's not ideal, but...
Sure. I mean, is that it now? I'm out of full screen. I haven't had this problem before.
It just worked though, so there's gonna be...
earlier.
What did I do?
Are you sharing the right, monitor tab? Are you on the right spot?
As far as I can tell, I'll try stopping and starting again. Do you see anything now?
No, Gary, if you want, can you share the link? It's a Google Slides. Can we?
It is.
Through? for you? You want to try that?
Yeah.
Let's just start.
Yep. All right. I'll just shout next. We'll see if this works. Okay. Thanks, everyone. So, yeah, what I'm talking about here in the hidden role of early career researchers in peer review, if we imagine, as we have here, a sort of typical peer review setup, a journal editor will reach out to 3 reviewers, ask them for the reviews. What I am interested in is what you can see on the right here, this involvement of other people by the invited reviewer. And typically what's happening here is that the invited reviewer will send a manuscript along to people in their lab, perhaps a postdoc or a grad student or multiple people, to involve them in the process. This is very common, but as we'll go into, it's a very interesting process. Next, please, Daniela. So I'm going to lay out some concrete definitions and scenarios here to give you, there's a bunch of flavors of what this process looks like, to try and give you a sense of what's going on. So let's imagine an invited reviewer passes a manuscript along to a grad student. Next, please. Right, and so in this review process, the reviewer, the PI, the head of the group, sits down with the grad student or the postdoc or whoever and discusses the review and works together in providing feedback. And this is often cited as a common way of providing training in peer review. Next, please. Yes. So what often happens is that the reviewer will then take that review and pass it back to the journal. But from the journal's perspective, only the invited reviewer has been involved, and there's no awareness of anyone else taking place. And so this is a co-reviewer. And so co-reviewing is kind of taking place, but our perspective is that this isn't quite correct. And so what we have been talking about and pushing for is this ethical co-reviewing, where both of the reviewers are known to be involved in the process, and that is passed along to the journal editor. The next process is where you have a reviewer who passes along the review. Now here the arrows are different because they have passed the paper along to the grad student. The grad student has given them a review back. The invited reviewer has not been involved. And the invited reviewer then takes that review and gives it to the journal. And so this is, as you can see, the worst case scenario where someone has essentially done someone else's work for them. And again, this also happens, and this is what we refer to as ghostwriting. That's somewhat being polite because technically this is plagiarism. It's not perhaps deliberate plagiarism. It is perhaps something that people have done in the past. This is how a lot of people were trained. People seem to think it's okay. We, in the work that we've been doing, talking about ethical co-reviewing and ghostwriting, we would like to maintain that this should not be the case. And so we have taken steps to try and address this problem. And one thing I want to make clear here, this is separate from credit. Credit that sort of externally happens for peer review. All of what we're talking about here is internal. This is something that only is known within the journal, the invited reviewer and the co-reviewer. So I became particularly interested in this because of an invitation to the ASAP Bio peer review meeting in 2018. And over the course of the meeting, this issue actually came up. It was discussed. And what was funny was every early career researcher in the meeting, I sort of informally polled about this phenomenon, and we had all taken part in some way, shape, or form in a hidden role in peer review. But many of the great and the good of academia and scholarship and scholarly publishing who were in attendance actually were quite angry and largely refused to believe that this was the case and that this could actually be happening. So my colleague, Dr. Rebecca Lyjak, and I, we found this pretty alarming and decided to organize a couple of workshops at the conference, discuss this, and it became clear that we were going to have to gather some data on the process. No data was really around beyond a small survey that the eLife Early Career Research Group had done. But also what was interesting was that in comparing notes with a bunch of people, it was clear that there were some nuances here and some interesting things going on that we wouldn't be able to get to without surveying a group of early career researchers. So we surveyed, I think, about just shy of 500 people we published a preprint that includes the results of that survey, but also a pretty comprehensive literature review about any literature on training or ghostwriting, such as it may have existed in peer review for people to see. And then we published the data in eLife, the data on the survey itself, in this manuscript. And I have a link to a resource doc that I had cleverly queued up, but everything has gone. Let me just drop this in again in the chat. I have a resource doc that links to all of these articles that you should be able to get from this link here. Next, please, Daniela. So from the eLife paper, I think this figure in particular really helped us to come up with these definitions. On the left, you can see here, we asked, to your knowledge, did your PI ever withhold your name from the editorial staff when you served as the reviewer or co-reviewer? Actually, about half of people knew that their name was withheld. Another third didn't know, and just under a quarter knew that their name had been given. Similarly, we asked, do you know if your PI submit your reviews with or without editing your work? And again, half of people knew their work had been edited in some way, but over a third didn't know if it had been edited, and 17% knew for sure it had not. So what you can sort of get a sense of here is the people who know their name was provided and who possibly know that their work was edited are getting the positive training experience that is being articulated as a reason for doing this. But most people aren't getting this experience. A lot of people are simply having their work taken along and put in with no feedback, no training. And so that just gives you a flavor of what's going on. Next, please, Daniela. So I want to talk a bit more about the aftermath of this, because Becky and I have continued to work on this, and in particular to try and figure out ways of sorting out this problem, and who should be sorting out various parts of the problem. Ghostwriting of peer review reports to us is bad. It can be exploitative. It definitely happens, but we're aware that it's not always deliberately this way. A lot of people were trained this way, and so we wanted to try and get more of a conversation going about why this is happening and why it shouldn't be happening. We particularly wanted to get in touch with journals or start drawing attention to journal editors about this. One thing that we find quite interesting in this space is the common complaint that there aren't enough reviewers, that there's not enough diversity in the reviewer pools. And from our perspective, there's a huge number of people doing reviews, and most of the diversity in the academic pool, particularly in the US, is in the early career researcher group. So it seems like this problem could actually be reasonably easily solved by simply acknowledging the role that early career researchers are playing, and trying to recognize that more in reviewer databases, and then in future invitations to review in their own right. So we wrote this policy-oriented paper, and in here, yes, please, thanks, Daniela. We had a set of recommendations for various different actors. So, you know, some of this is informing yourself about what's going on, and particularly a role that we think invited reviewers have of making sure that they're carrying out ethical training with people. One thing that really came up, and next please, Daniela, that came up in the light also with work that I also was able to do with some folks using the transpose database of journal policies. Journal policies are pretty unclear broadly across many things, but specifically peer review and preprint policies we found were quite unclear. And so one thing that came up as quite obvious was many journals have very prohibitive language in that you are supposed to ask for permission before you share the paper, which of course nobody does. And then of course, once you've shared the paper, to then say that you did what you said you weren't going to do is part of a reason we think that people are not communicating names. And so we're trying to give journals a sense of this is going to happen anyway. Some journals explicitly forbid early career researchers from being part of the review process, but I would say that they are going to be part of the process regardless, and this is simply going to happen. And so having space for asking directly who else was involved, not even asking was someone involved, but just say, put the name here, would just be a great step towards that. Next, please. Yeah, so we have this flow chart that's in the paper that we also put up in Zenodo, that is a template that we would hope journals would take on and use to used to highlight and educate reviewers about the process of ethical co-review, what they should be doing, what the various policies are. For us also, it became interesting talking to journals that conflict of interest is a real problem here. Your conflict of interest checking is basically useless if, a quarter of the people, you're only checking a quarter of the people who are actually involved in the review process that you're talking about. Next, please. Yep, so we think this is a bunch of benefits across all the different actors here. To me, though, this is a very fundamental issue around gatekeeping in the academy. I have been surprised, perhaps not surprised, but disappointed at how many people have said to me, oh, well, postdocs shouldn't be doing peer review anyway, which is really just an infantilizing notion. I always respond, what you're telling me you're giving PhDs from your university to people who don't know how to critically read a paper, and that usually causes some consternation. So there's a lot of that kind of nonsense going on, and so we're really keen to try and just really acknowledge who's taking part in peer review. Daniela really highlighted a lot that came up with our work, that the training is almost entirely absent for anyone who has been doing peer review, and so really trying to make peer review better is a key goal of this. And I just want to give acknowledgements. Daniela has already hinted to the project that we're very kindly being funded by NSF for. Dr. Becky Lijak on the left there has been leading this project, and Doctors Mina Balgopal, Sarah Fankhauser, and then of course Daniela herself are there. I also want to thank Jessica Polga from ASAP Bio. And yeah, I want to thank you for your time. Sorry about the technical hitch. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. That was a great talk. Don't stress too much about time. I think we've got plenty. So again, we'll hold our questions until the end and just keep moving on. So Sameen will be next. So Simine Vazire is a professor here at the University of Melbourne within the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences. She studies meta-science and research methods and practices, as well as personality psychology and self-knowledge. Sameen received her BA from Carleton College in 2000 and her PhD from the University of Texas at Austin in 2006. She's been an editor at several journals, so she'll be well placed to contribute to a lot of these questions, I imagine. Including editor-in-chief of Social Psychology and Personality Science, and founding co-senior editor of the open access journal Collabora Psychology. So together with Brian Nosek, Sameen founded the Society for the Improvements of Psychological Science, or SIPS. She serves on the board of PLOS and BITS and was a member of the executive committee of the Association of Psychological Science. So I'll let you just go for it, Sameen, when you're ready. Take it away.
Great, thanks so much. Those were some great presentations. And it's funny because every time I think that I'm going to be like the cynical kind of downer, I get even more cynical when I hear about other data, information, evidence that I didn't even know about. So yeah, this is going to build on Gary's presentation. I don't have slides, I'm just going to talk. And I wanted to talk about the problems of lack of accountability in peer review, some of which have already been touched on, of course. But more broadly, my experience when I became an editor and saw kind of how journal policies are set, what influences editors, things like that, and talking to other editors, realizing that I had this default assumption that journal editors tend to be benevolent and generous, they're doing this huge service and probably they're ethical and things like that. And it was quite disillusioning to me to see how things actually work behind the scenes, the amount of pressure that editors kind of let themselves be exposed to do things that are maybe unethical despite COPE guidelines. I mean, it's not that surprising when you think about the PIs that Gary is describing. In many communities, the pool of editors is from the same pool as these PIs. So if people seem to think it's okay to co-opt the work of their trainees and things like that, then it's not surprising that editors also think it's okay to do things that are questionable from an ethical standpoint. So what I want to talk about is what we could do to increase accountability of journals and more generally in the peer review process. So that includes reducing things like bias, error, corruption in peer review, and trying to find ways to tie journals' reputations to their actual processes. So reward journals that are doing a better job and hold journals accountable that aren't doing a good job, which would require more transparency in some domains. So transparency will be a theme through my comments. So first I want to talk about some of the problems I think exist in peer review, ranging from relatively kind of not necessarily minor, but like understandable ones that I'm not really sure that we could ever get rid of. Things like standards are not always applied evenly across papers, right? So depending on which editor or which reviewers you get, they may or may not think this particular method is okay. So you might get rejected because you use this method, but another paper gets accepted because they use that method. So that's frustrating. It would be nice to try to standardize that. And then that also feeds into things like status bias and other kinds of biases in peer review. So because the standards aren't applied uniformly, that leaves room for, part of the variance in how editors and reviewers respond to a specific paper is affected by the status of the authors. I think the evidence for status bias in peer review is quite clear. There's mixed evidence for more specific kinds of biases depending on other characteristics of the authors, but there's definitely bias. And one thing that's been interesting to me in my work as an editor and talking to other editors is how often editors just explicitly endorse status bias. There's not even the pretense that we shouldn't use the author's status or their institution status as an indicator of how we should handle their paper. So I've talked to editors who say, yeah, of course I use the author's identity in deciding whether or not to triage a paper because I know that a paper from this lab is going to be worthy of being sent out for peer review. I don't even need to read it, so I save time by skipping that step for those papers. Just super openly saying that. And in my experience as editor-in-chief at one of the journals I was editor, I got explicit pressure from the publication committee telling me that I was stepping on important people's toes after I had just rejected some papers by famous authors. They forwarded me an anonymous email from an award-winning social psychologist saying, Sameen just rejected my paper. I found this distasteful and I will never submit to this journal again. And when I tried to say, okay, but what was wrong with my decision? That was not the point of the conversation. It was, if you're making important people unhappy, then you must be doing something wrong. That's just not okay. We can't have that. This journal is going to hurt the reputation of the journal. Other kinds of problems are biased, hostile, unprofessional comments from the editors or from reviewers in peer review. So this can include, I think it's a little bit different in different fields. In psychology, we often see comments about, this would be better suited for a specialty journal. Those comments being much more likely to come up when your population of participants is not from the standard kind of Western industrialized, mostly North America, Western Europe countries. Other things can happen in the peer review process that are unethical, like reviewers or editors pressuring authors to cite papers that either they're authors of or cite other papers in that journal to boost the journal's impact factor. But more generally, reviewers and editors have a lot of leverage to pressure authors to do things that they think should be done. And partly that's the point of peer review, right? Like if I think that this method has these limitations, you should acknowledge these limitations. Okay, that's the point of peer review. But then it's a slippery slope to, I think that you should really acknowledge this theory and it's better than that theory or whatever. It gets to a point where some things are subjective and authors might feel maybe correctly that they have to make these changes in order to appease the reviewers and editors. So the kind of gatekeeping that it's really hard to draw the line between appropriate and inappropriate kind of influencing authors. But authors are clearly not free to just take or leave whatever recommendations that they agree with. And that's a problem, I think. And then, of course, conflicts of interest. So editors and reviewers agreeing to handle manuscripts that they have a conflict of interest with. I'm just shocked how often I'll tell an editor when I'm invited to review, I have this conflict of interest. And their response is, that's fine, go ahead and review. I'm like, no, I wasn't asking. I'm telling you that I have a conflict of interest. And it's really shocking to me how much people are willing to excuse or ignore conflicts of interest. And also editors publishing in their own journals, I think, is a huge conflict of interest. In my field, it's not even declared as a conflict of interest on the publication. And there aren't standards and norms about how much that's okay to do, what steps should be taken to make sure the peer review process is still rigorous and so on. And then at the extreme, there's corruption. So things like editors editing reviews in ways that influence the substance of the message, and also that violate the reviewer's agency and copyright over their comments. Or just, yeah, in some cases, just outright making up peer review process, like not actually taking a paper through the peer review process, but pretending that it did go through it, et cetera. And a lot of these things are happening in journals that endorse the COPE guidelines. And I think it's a problem that we do have these like publication ethics standards, but that's not really enough. It's probably helping, but it's not helping enough. So what are some potential steps we could take that might alleviate these problems? So some of these have already been on display here in the talks earlier. So things like making at least some parts of the peer review process more transparent. So there was a question in the comment about, shouldn't we also identify the identity, make the identity of the reviewers transparent? I think even if we don't do that, which I think there are good reasons not to do that, we can get into that maybe in the Q&A, but even if we don't do that, we can make the content of the peer review transparent. I think there's very little reason not to make the content transparent. And so that would allow readers and members of the scientific community to see what the process of peer review looks like for a particular paper, and that's very important, right? If I want to know, maybe this paper is a bit outside my area of expertise, should I trust these authors' claims? Well, seeing how rigorous and thorough and broad the peer review vetting would be helpful, but also it allows the community to assess a journal's process in general, to see patterns. Like, is this journal often letting reviewers make comments that lead to bias in peer review, or is this journal typically getting rigorous reviewers vetting but many different aspects of the paper, and so on. So I think making the content of peer review transparent, at least for accepted papers, right, for published papers, to me that seems like a no-brainer. And going hand in hand with that, I would say for all papers, including rejected papers, giving authors the right to share their reviews and their decision letters as publicly as they want. So right now, authors don't feel like they have that right, and the rules are actually quite vague. I've talked to people who are more familiar with COPE guidelines than I am, and it's understandable and legitimate for authors to feel like maybe they're not allowed to share the content of reviews and decision letters, which means that when papers are rejected, authors have no way to, tell their story of what happened if they think there was some bias or corruption in the peer review process. It also means that the community can't see patterns in the peer review that happens for rejected papers. So I think we need to give authors that freedom if they want to share their decision letters and reviews. Of course, in that case, reviewers need to be informed that their reviews could be shared publicly. I think editors should always assume that their decision letters could be shared publicly. That just comes with the job, in my opinion. We could name handling editors on every paper, so at least any conflict of interest between the handling editor and the authors would be public. Again, I don't think we should require reviewers to identify themselves and be named on every paper, but editors have more responsibility, and I think that responsibility should come with being named on every paper that's published that you handled. A bare minimum thing we could do is make sure that when the decision letters and reviews goes out from the editor to the authors, that reviewers get a copy of that, so that it is a minimum kind of protection against really corrupt, unethical practices from editors, where they can hide, make up, pretend reviewer comments and things like that. That it helps a bit if at least reviewers see what happens, the outcome. I think we should have clearer and stricter rules about conflicts of interest. I mean, I think many journals do have really clear rules, but they just don't apply them. So I'm not sure what to do about that. And another thing we should really work on, that was a big part of Daniela's presentation, is diversifying the reviewer and editor pools. And that's important for many, many different reasons, including that it affects the quality and the fairness of the peer review. So you really need reviewers with a broad range of backgrounds and experiences in order to find the appropriate reviewers for different manuscripts. And also, I think that issues of fairness come up when the reviewer and editor pool comes from a very different and privileged group compared to the author pool. I think that we should encourage journals to have as many explicit standards as possible. So there's some things that we can't write explicit standards for, but some things we can. So if you're going to, if some editors are going to say we just don't accept review papers or meta-analyses or whatever, then that should be a stated policy. And if editors are just going rogue and saying that, but it's not a stated policy, then we should do better in catching that and at least making some things standardized across the board. Journals could have a transparent policy for appeals, so that when authors do feel like something was unfair or wrong, there's a clear policy and everyone has access to what that policy is. And then I think there's some really great concrete innovations have come out of peer review and out of Replicats and a few other groups that have really been innovating with peer review. So things like one aspect I love about peer review is allowing reviewers to maintain their anonymity by using a pseudonym, but there's somebody behind the scenes that knows who everyone is, so that we can check for things like conflicts of interest. We can hold people accountable if they act in an unprofessional way, things like that. Replicats also did a really great job of broadening the pool of reviewers, bringing in people who aren't typically invited to do reviews and training them in peer review and giving them an opportunity to review papers for a research project rather than for a journal in this case, and also implementing a structured deliberation approach to peer review, which I think could be a really interesting way to try to standardize at least some basic aspects of peer review. So if all the reviewers come together and discuss their reviews, then maybe we would be able to educate and kind of fix inconsistencies in how people are applying policies or things like that. Another development would be things like modular reviews, so allowing people to review just a narrow aspect of a research output. Maybe they check the computational reproducibility of the paper, or they evaluate just the paper from a theoretical aspect or just a statistical aspect, things like that. I think the technology we have now should make that more and more possible to, in some cases, do a distributed kind of review. I think we still need some reviewers to do the more holistic review, just in case each component is okay, but the fit between the components might be a source of problem. And I think the idea of kind of piggybacking on existing reviews that happen in this informal way, like journal clubs, right? We all spend a good chunk of our time reading papers and evaluating them outside of the formal peer review process. And that generates a lot of knowledge that would be really valuable to share. So finding a way to share that information in a way that gives appropriate credit to the people that are putting in that time, I think would be great. And then I think a really big challenge of any kind of advance in peer review is how to deal with the same kind of status bias that we see in a traditional peer review model would exist and potentially be exacerbated in a model where things are more open and free for all, where the people who get the most attention, most reads and reviews of their papers are the people who are already well known. So I do think we need to think about what aspects of kind of gatekeeping or a top-down approach are good and help, and what aspects do we want to get rid of or fix or change. And I think one of the most beneficial aspects of having an editor or some coordinator of peer review is to make sure that every author who wants reviews, who wants their paper looked at, wants feedback, is able to get at least some. And I think if we just went for like a free-for-all, just everyone can choose what to review, when to review, et cetera, then that would be a big problem, as well as a problem of conflicts of interest and corruption, like reviewer rings and things like that. So I do think we need some coordination, someone kind of tracking who's doing what and making sure that things remain relatively balanced and fair. So just to summarize, I think the key thing that we need to be thinking about is what should we be expecting journals to do in peer review? Are they doing it? And most of the time the answer is we don't know. We can't tell what's actually happening in peer review. And so we can't hold journals accountable. We can't tell if there's patterns of bias or corruption, and we can't tell which journals are adding value in their peer review process, which journals might be actually harming the scientific community, introducing bias, gatekeeping in ways that are not good for science. And so the first step is to bring as much out into the open as we can that would help us evaluate that. That doesn't mean making everything 100% out in the open or free for all, right? We need to think about how to balance different values here. But right now there's too much secrecy. Like peer review at many journals is just a black box, and we're just expected to trust that things were vetted in a fair way. And there's very, very little way to verify that or hold journals accountable. And most of the pressure on editors right now is just to keep the famous people happy. There's not a lot of pressure or incentive for editors to do a good job in peer review on other dimensions, right? The most consequential thing that reviewers feel is whether the most powerful people in their field are happy with the journal and the journal's impact factor and number of submissions. So those are the things that they're told to like make sure the journal performs well on, and that's a really big problem. So we need to think about how we can make journals' reputation rest more on what they're actually providing. And maybe the future means that journals aren't the ones that, maybe peer review needs to be wrested out of the hands of journals if they're not going to live up to that. And I think that's another really great initiative I think we should be talking about is journal agnostic peer review, like peer community preprint reviews are obviously journal agnostic as well. And also consistent with that is thinking of peer review as something that continues even after a paper is accepted at a journal. So peer review is not just something that happens once at one journal, but it's something that that's our job, right? Is continuing to critically evaluate the literature and sometimes updating when we go back and look at older literature and our interpretation of it changes. We should be able to update the community's evaluation of that output. Okay, I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot for that, Sameen. And thanks everyone for all these 3 fantastic talks. We've still got a little bit of time, so we could probably spend the next 10 minutes just answering some of these questions. I can see a fair few that have cropped up, so maybe I'll just read from the first one that I can see. So Daniel Manrique asks whether maybe endorsing double-blind review may be beneficial in minimizing biases. Does anyone have any thoughts about that question?
Yeah, I think Daniela's point is good that it doesn't always work, and I think it increasingly won't work. So like, for example, at Collabora, one of the things we do is we do ask authors to submit their manuscript without a title page and without the author's names, but we don't ask them to bend over backwards to remove all traces. So if they have a preprint up, if they have data or materials up online with their names, that's fine. But what we want to do is we want to be able to send to reviewers a version of the manuscript where the names and identities of the authors are not front and center, and we tell the reviewers that we're intentionally doing this because we don't think it's relevant. Sure, you can go and find the names, but we at least want to communicate to reviewers that we think that that shouldn't be a factor. Of course, how much they can control letting that influence them is idealistic. I think we need to accept that, especially with preprints, it's going to become impossible for reviewers' identities, or authors' identities to be masked during the peer review process. So we need to think of other safeguards against status bias.
I just want to add that in one recent workshop, someone also brought up how they were engaged in a double blind, and it was like sometimes the guests could actually also be harmful, because for a new group that comes up and does some work, then you're like attributing it to an existing group. Like just we need to acknowledge that we're human beings and we want to put labels on things. So I think like unmasking that and acknowledging and making policies and transparency be the armor towards that is much better than saying like, oh no, but like we can be unbiased. It's like, I think that's like a harmful approach.
Mm-hmm.
I can ask another question here from Bob Reed. So Bob asks, why don't more journals make the reviews public? They could be anonymized, but just having the reviews available for others to see would go far in making reviewers act and write more professionally. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so both Daniela and Gary mentioned that they think that journals are concerned that reviewers will be less likely to accept review requests. I think that's true. I'm sure that's a big part of the reason why journals don't do it. I think that assumption is not necessarily well-founded. So I do think in some fields that might be true, and it's probably very specific to different communities. But another thing that journals don't, this is my experience a lot, when I tried to change journal policies as editor, the people setting policy, who are not always editors, in my case would often say, oh, we don't know how the field's going to react, I don't know if they're ready for that, et cetera. But one thing they're not factoring in is maybe people don't like the status quo, and maybe reviewers would actually, I mean, for more and more as a reviewer now, when I get asked to review, I'll say I'll review it if my review will be made public, because I'm putting a lot of work into this. And if the paper ends up published, my comments could be put to use by other readers, and so I'm not sure we should assume that reviewers would be averse to that, or that they would prefer for their comments to remain private. I think it's an empirical question. In psychology, I don't think that fear is warranted. So the journals that have adopted transparent review, I mean, Collabora does, and I haven't heard anybody bring it up as a reason for turning down a review request. Although, of course, our sub-community is not representative of the mainstream psychology community, but still, I think it's obviously doable in psychology.
I think sort of following up on your point, Sameen, from earlier, that often when this comes up, a journal will say, famous name has said that they would stop reviewing if we did this. And it's like exactly what you're talking about before. Like we have to remember the like prestige effects and the pedigree and everything and the network effects going on here are determining a lot of this, regardless of how many people are really interested in having their peer review reports be open. There's a group who are also like the group kind of in charge who don't. And so all those interesting things come into play. Yeah.
So I can see we have another question asking whether whether reviewers are able to post their reviews publicly or not.
That's a great question. So mostly not if the paper isn't public. And then, so then the question is, let's say, so there's a case that blew up on Twitter, or blew up within my little world, where there's a reviewer who apparently, I don't know this person, but apparently they have a policy that they'll only review papers if there's a preprint publicly available. And in that case, they also post their review as a blog post about the preprint. And so they reviewed a paper. They ended up posting the review on their blog post, but they didn't say that this was a review for a journal, because actually you're not allowed to. So the very fact that the paper was under review at a journal is privileged information that you're not supposed to share. So basically they just wrote it as a blog post about a preprint, as if they read the preprint and reviewed, or evaluating it for fun or something like that. And the authors got really, really mad and said, that's not okay. You're not allowed to do that. But obviously if you post a preprint, in my opinion, it is fair game for people to write.
Oh, I know, right? That's a lot of people say that, like for preprints, I was like, how do you do that? Do you ask authors if they are, like, now we're implementing author-driven requests, because I think it's actually not because of this reason why, like, we need authors' permission, but because it could be a way for authors to post preprints sooner if they actually find positive around getting feedback. But it's like, that's amazing. Yeah. And the other thing is that copyright is like a huge mess and it's never understood. But I think that most journals copyright the reviews belongs to the journal. So you are not, and it's not a CC BY thing. So that would also be a violation, but it's ridiculous. It's all about journals keeping control. I think inertia is a big issue of like changing rules. One of the main issues with peer review that some of the early career researchers found last week was rigidity, just like they don't want to change because it works for them. So why would they put any work into changing something that doesn't bring in more money? But I think we're hitting a point in which hopefully those will be squished by more open initiatives.
So I thought I might just indulge myself with one question for you three. Pragmatist that I am, I'm curious to ask, what do you think are some of the low-hanging fruit in this area, some of the easy things that maybe we could do that might help me, say, increase transparency in the way that journals do things, for example, or hold editors and journals more accountable when it comes to peer review?
I mean, I'm personally, in like other realms of work I do, a great fan of collecting data about what everyone's doing and just putting it up and comparing everyone. People don't like being compared to their peers. And they especially don't like when you can't even compare because you're like, I can't even find this. And, you know, when we did the transpose database and gathered a bunch of policies about open peer review, co-reviewing, and preprint policies, you know, and then published, this is very unclear. It's actually amazing how many journals or editors came forward to us and were like, oh, we want to put our thing in your database. We have updated this, we have clarified. It then becomes the thing of wanting to be in the database. So we started hearing from more places that we hadn't found. You know, that sort of thing, it's relatively easy to do. It takes just a bit of time, you know, scraping websites, right? But I think in thinking about what we're doing next with the journal policy part, you know, we have made we've reached out to a couple of places and a few journals to say, hey, could you change this policy? Like, we've identified this problem. And for various reasons, it seems there's not a lot of traction. And so the next step might be to track policies, whether or not they've changed, and then ask why they haven't, and again, compare everyone. So that's easy to do. That's sort of low-hanging fruit. Yeah.
I love that journalistic approach. And it's always something that we wanted to do for review. We never had time because I'm the only full-time person on the team, and so I'm looking forward to pairing more with you. And you know, the data on pre-review is available. But anyway, the thing that my answer, I think it would be to really continue. And I don't know if that's a long-hanging fruit, but advocating for like the power like the old researchers have to say no to a review that doesn't go published. And then of course it's like, it's very easy to say like, oh, you should do that when all the incentives are actually not there. But I do think that unfortunately in this space, the incentives do follow action from the bottom up. So we are here to continue to like bring this like activist perspective into research and see if the next generations of researchers can be more socially conscious, more active in the open space.
Yeah, and building on that, I think reviewers are in a pretty good position in terms of activism because there's not a lot to lose, right? If a journal asks you to do a review for them for free, if you say no because of these values or policies, the worst that can happen is they say, okay, well, then you don't do the review. You didn't lose much. I mean, losing the opportunity to review has some costs, but also big benefits in terms of your time. So yeah, I think that sometimes when we can't afford to be as principled as an author, like we can't just not publish in certain journals if that matters a lot for our careers or our trainees' careers. We could be more principled, value driven in our choices as reviewers. So that would be one option. And also in how we talk about journals and how we evaluate, job candidates, things like that, instead of referring to journals' reputation based on just prestige or impact factor, things like that, like pointing out, oh, but this journal does transparent review. So actually I trust their papers more because their peer review process is more accountable. Like if they were doing bad peer review, that would be more likely to get caught. So the papers that make it through that journal, so using that kind of language when talking about journals, or when your colleagues say, oh, they published so many papers in this prestige journal, pointing out, well, we don't actually know how rigorous that, we know they reject a lot of papers, but we don't know on what basis or what factors play into the decisions in the peer review and so on. So starting to kind of give more credit to journals that do transparent peer review and question how we can give a good reputation to journals where we don't know, starting that conversation in situations where you're not, the one being evaluated, but maybe you're part of the team evaluating someone else. It's another thing we could do. Yeah, I mean, there's some campaigns to get journals to change policies that have been really successful, like registered reports. You see the number of journals adopting registered reports. And that, I think that we could do the same with transparent review. Just start having conversations with journals about why they're not doing it. What assumptions are they making? What are the fears? How can we address those with empirical data or, surveys, things like that, try to really get at what's holding back journals. And I think transparent review, in my opinion, it's the most important. I don't know how low hanging it is, but I don't think it's unrealistic. And it's really important because I think it would be a stepping stone to a lot of other things. Once we have transparent review, we could start to point out more concrete problems, do more meta science about how often these problems come up, things like that. And I think it would identify a bunch of other problems we would need to deal with, but we need transparent review to even identify them.
See a lot of good stuff. I can see some more questions as well, but given we've got about 25 minutes left to go, Susan, I'm not sure if you're there, whether we do want to actually, what we might do is create 3 breakout rooms. And what we'll do is we'll place Gary, Daniela, and Sameen each in one. And feel free to jump in to a breakout room if you have any questions that you wanted to ask them directly. Maybe while Susan's setting it up, I do have a question about if anyone has any thoughts about paying reviewers for their reviews. Does anyone have any thoughts on that can of worms?
Gary,
I like
yeah, go Simine.
Well, I'll say I like Almost Point in the chat, and I'm pretty sure I've read his blog post, so I'm probably being influenced by that too. But that I think reputational benefits to good reviewers should be more of a thing. And if we had that, then maybe payment wouldn't be as important, because in one scenario, it would even be a career track. If you're just get a reputation as being a really, really good reviewer, that becomes a dedicated career. I think paying is complicated in part because we're trying to move away from some business models that require a lot of money. And so then only the really established publishers can get in on that. And if we add more money, but given where we're spending money now, I'd rather that money be spent on reviewers. But I also like the idea of making it very easy for people to start journals without a huge financial obstacle. So I'm torn.
Right, maybe before we get too far into it, maybe we should go into breakout rooms. Unless Daniela, you wanted to say something to add on to what Sameen said?
I'll just say that I agree with that completely. So I'll just see whoever comes to the breakout.
Okay, so Susan, do we just start placing people into rooms?
People just can choose whatever the rooms they want to go to.
Ah, I see.
Right? Can you?
Mm-hmm.
I'll pause the record. I'll stop the recording now, by the way.